girl falls off her bike and is helped by a rich woman. But when the rich woman sends for the girl's father, her world collapses upon discovering that, on a summer day, the life of Clara, a brave young girl, takes an unexpected turn. A fall, an improbable encounter, a determined girl looking after her family, and an elegant woman with a secret from the past. It was a typical summer day, and Clara, a 12-year-old girl, was riding down a quiet street on her old bike. The sun shone brightly, illuminating her brown hair as she coasted down a gently sloping hill. The bike, a gift inherited from her late mother, was in poor condition. Despite the squeaky brakes and the wheels begging for maintenance, she ventured out daily, using the bike as transportation to run small errands and help support her younger siblings, Emma and Tom. As she pedaled, lost in thoughts of how to make more money to buy food, Clara felt a jolt. The bike chain slipped, and before she could react, one of the wheels came loose. With a muffled scream, she fell onto the hot asphalt. A sharp pain shot through her knee and elbow, followed by small tears welling up in her brown eyes. Sitting on the ground, she looked at her scrapes and the damaged bike, feeling a mix of physical pain and desperation. She glanced around for help, but the street was deserted. With the scorching heat, few people ventured outside at that hour. Clara bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears of frustration. Now what? How am I going to continue? She murmured to herself, feeling overwhelmed by the situation. The sense of helplessness started to consume her when she heard the sound of an approaching engine. She looked up to see a sleek car, a model she had only seen in movies or magazines, pulling up beside her. The dark window rolled down smoothly, revealing a noble-looking woman with neatly styled gray hair and a gentle expression. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Clara blinked, surprised by the situation. She wasn't used to receiving attention, let alone from someone who looked so sophisticated. I think I hurt my knee," she replied hesitantly, pointing to her leg. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Margareth, got out of the car with a worried expression. She quickly assessed Clara's injuries before crouching down beside her. "Let's take care of that. Come, I'll take you home," she said, extending her hand to help Clara up. At first, Clara hesitated. The idea of getting into a stranger's car was scary, but the pain and desperation were overwhelming. Reluctantly, she accepted the help and got into the car. Inside the vehicle, Clara felt out of place, surrounded by luxury and comfort. The soft leather seats and the pleasant scent of the car were far removed from her everyday life. Mrs. Margareth glanced at Clara through the rearview mirror, noticing the girl's discomfort. "Don't worry, dear. I just want to help," she said, offering a reassuring smile. "Where do you live? I'm sure your parents are worried." Clara lowered her head, feeling a lump forming in her throat. "No. I live alone with my siblings. My mother passed away, and my father is sick." The words came out low and sad, laden with the harsh reality Clara had grown used to facing. Mrs. Margareth frowned, clearly moved by what she heard. "I see," she murmured softly. "You're very brave, you know that? Taking care of your siblings at such a young age is a huge responsibility." Clara simply nodded, speechless. She gazed out the window, trying to process the strange turn of events. Within minutes, the car arrived at a grand mansion, something Clara could never have imagined seeing up close. The large carved wooden doors opened to reveal an even more luxurious interior. Clara felt a mix of awe and intimidation as she followed Mrs. Margareth inside the house. Arriving at the mansion, Clara was speechless. It was the first time she had seen such an imposing house. The building, in a classic style, looked like something out of a fairy tale, with its white facade and grand columns. The gardens were meticulously kept, full of colorful flowers and bushes trimmed into geometric shapes. Intimidated by the size and beauty of the place, Clara followed Mrs. Margareth, who guided her through large carved wooden doors. Inside, the wealth and luxury were even more impressive. Clara found herself in a large hall with marble floors, adorned with Persian rugs and elegant furniture. Large crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, warm light over the room. The silence and sophistication of the mansion were overwhelming for Clara, who was used to the simplicity of her small apartment. Mrs. Margareth led Clara to a comfortable living room, where the girl was seated on a soft sofa. Clara sank into the seat, feeling small and out of place. As she settled, a maid appeared with a tray full of food that Clara had never seen in her life. There were delicate sandwiches, fresh fruits, juices, and a variety of sweets that looked like something out of a dream. Clara looked at the food hesitantly. "Can I?" she asked, barely audible, looking at Mrs. Margareth with wide, questioning eyes. "Of course, my dear. You can eat whatever you like." Mrs. Margareth's voice was gentle and welcoming, filled with a sweetness Clara did not expect to find. "You must be hungry after all that." Clara picked up a sandwich with trembling fingers, biting into it slowly. The flavor was incredible, unlike anything she had ever tasted. As she ate, Mrs. Margareth made a discreet gesture to her driver. He quickly left, on a mission to fetch a new bike for Clara, something Mrs. Margareth hoped would bring a bit of joy to the young girl who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Sitting on the sofa, Clara began to relax a little. The elegant walls and luxurious furniture began to feel less intimidating. Mrs. Margareth sat beside her and, with a warm smile, started a conversation. "Tell me more about yourself, Clara. How have you and your siblings been managing?" she asked with a genuine look of interest. Clara hesitated, but Mrs. Margareth's sincere gaze encouraged her to speak. "Well, we manage as best we can. I do small jobs to make money. I clean gardens, wash cars, take care of children, anything I can to help." Mrs. Margareth nodded, listening attentively. "That must be very difficult for someone so young to have so many responsibilities." "Sometimes it is," Clara admitted, looking at her hands. "But I don't have a choice. I have to take care of my siblings. They mean everything to me." The sincerity and determination in Clara's words touched Mrs. Margareth's heart. She could see the maturity beyond Clara's years and the burden she carried. Mrs. Margareth decided she would do everything in her power to help these children. "You are a very brave girl, Clara. Few people would have the strength you do. I will help you, and I promise that things will get better." Mrs. Margareth's words were comforting, but Clara still felt a sense of caution. What did this woman really want? Why was she being so kind? But there was something in Mrs. Margareth's eyes, a sincerity and kindness that Clara couldn't ignore. She decided to trust her, at least for now. Maybe, just maybe, her luck was beginning to change for the better. As Clara shared her story, Mrs. Margareth listened closely, a shadow of sadness appearing in her blue eyes. The woman, surrounded by luxury, felt a tightening in her chest as she heard about the struggles Clara had faced. Clara's life seemed like a series of challenges and sacrifices, something that Mrs. Margareth, with all her comfort, had never experienced. Clara spoke of her daily routine, which began early to care for her siblings before heading out to work. She performed small tasks for neighbors, such as cleaning gardens, washing cars, and even babysitting, all to earn a few coins. With the money she made, she bought food and medicine for her father. The little that remained, she saved for emergencies. Her life was a constant battle to ensure her siblings had the bare minimum to survive. "It's hard," Clara said, her voice breaking, "but I would do anything for Emma and Tom. They depend on me." Mrs. Margareth, moved by the girl's story, felt an urgent need to help. She knew she couldn't let that child return to such a difficult life without doing something to improve her situation. In a soft but determined voice, she told Clara that she wanted to help her family. Clara, not fully understanding what that meant, looked at the woman with a mixture of hope and fear. Could she trust her? Was it possible that someone so wealthy and distant from her reality could care about a poor girl like her? How could you help us?" Clara asked with a hint of suspicion. Mrs. Margareth took a deep breath, aware of the responsibility she was about to take on. "I would like to meet your family, Clara. Learn more about you and see how I can help." She paused, evaluating the girl's reaction. "Maybe we can find a way to make your life a little easier." Determined to make a difference, Mrs. Margareth asked her driver to bring Clara's father and siblings. She wanted to meet the family and better understand how she could assist. While they waited, Clara and Mrs. Margareth continued to talk. With each word, Clara felt more comfortable, as if she were talking to an old friend. She felt an odd connection to this woman, something she couldn't explain. My mother used to say that life always has a way of surprising us, sometimes in good ways, Clara commented, looking at Mrs. Margareth with a half-smile. Maybe she was right. Mrs. Margareth smiled gently. I think your mother was a wise woman, and you have the same strength she had, Clara. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Time seemed to pass slowly as they waited. Clara was eager to see her siblings and tell them about Mrs. Margareth's kindness. She began to imagine a life where they might not have to worry about food or medicine anymore. Maybe, just maybe, they could find some peace. But when the driver finally returned, the grave expression on his face signaled that something was wrong. He entered the room with Emma and Tom, who ran into Clara's arms, but there was no sign of their father. Clara immediately realized something was wrong. With wide eyes and a trembling voice, she asked the driver about her father. The man hesitated for a moment, visibly uncomfortable, before informing her that when he arrived at their home, he found Clara's father lifeless. He had passed away while Clara was out, likely earlier that morning when she left to find work. The news was a devastating blow for Clara. It felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The driver's words echoed in her mind, but they seemed incomprehensible. Shock was followed by a wave of pain and despair, and tears welled up in her eyes. She hugged her siblings tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility grow exponentially. Now, they were not only motherless but fatherless as well. Emma and Tom, too young to fully understand the situation, cried, sensing only the sadness radiating from Clara and the absence of their father. The room, which had once seemed welcoming and full of promise, now felt cold and oppressive. Mrs. Margareth, witnessing the children's grief, approached with a pained and empathetic expression, trying to comfort Clara. You are not alone, she said, placing a caring hand on Clara's shoulder. I'm here to help. I promise I'll take care of you. Clara, through her tears, looked at Mrs. Margareth. She didn't know if she could believe in promises of comfort and security. Life had been so hard and unpredictable that it was difficult to believe that something good could happen. However, the kindness and firmness in Mrs. Margareth's eyes offered a small spark of hope. Maybe, with this generous woman's help, they could find a new beginning. Mrs. Margareth, realizing the urgent need for support, began to plan the next steps. She knew she couldn't replace Clara's mother or father, but she was determined to provide the children with a better life. She decided that she would adopt Clara, Emma, and Tom, taking on the responsibility for their welfare and future. The decision was made with her heart, but also with a clear determination to right a tragedy that never should have happened. I want you to know that you have a home here with me, she said, her voice full of sincerity. This house is big enough for all of us, and you'll have everything you need. I promise to take care of you as if you were my own children. Clara, still in shock from her father's death, felt a mix of relief and sadness. Mrs. Margareth's offer was a ray of hope amidst the darkness. She looked at Emma and Tom, nestled beside her, and whispered, "It's going to be all right. We'll stay together, and we'll get through this." The adoption process began quickly. Mrs. Margareth, using her influence and resources, initiated all the necessary legal proceedings to become the children's legal guardian. During meetings with lawyers and social workers, details about the family began to emerge. It was then that an unexpected revelation came to light. Clara, Emma, and Tom were actually Mrs. Margareth's nieces and nephew. The discovery was a shock to everyone. The children's mother, who had passed away, was Mrs. Margareth's younger sister. The sisters had lost contact many years ago after a family argument that was never resolved. Margareth vaguely remembered her younger sister, who had always been independent and rebellious. They had gone their separate ways, and fate, in its cruel irony, had brought the children of that lost sister back into Margaretha's life. The discovery was accompanied by a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for all the lost time and the tragic circumstances that led to their reunion, but also relief in knowing that these children had a blood connection with her. Mrs. Margareth felt an even greater responsibility to care for them, knowing now that they were her own flesh and blood. She felt called to make up for the mistakes of the past, both hers and her sister's, by caring for those who remained. "I never imagined I would find my family this way," Mrs. Margareth said, tears in her eyes during a conversation with Clara. "But fate brought us back together, and I will do everything I can to take care of you." Clara, hearing the revelation, felt a strange mix of emotions. The pain of losing her father was still fresh, but knowing she had an aunt, someone who cared, brought a small spark of hope. She and her siblings were about to start a new life, surrounded by family they never knew existed. "I didn't even know we had an aunt," Clara said with a shy smile. "My mother never talked about it." Mrs. Margareth sighed, recalling the argument that separated them. "We drifted apart over silly things that seemed important at the time but now feel so small." She squeezed Clara's hand. "But what matters is that we're together now, and I'll do everything I can to give you a better life." Mrs. Margareth wasted no time in providing a new beginning for the children. The house was adapted to accommodate them comfortably, and plans were made for their education and future needs. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, especially for Clara, who carried many responsibilities and painful memories. However, she was determined to give them a life full of opportunities and love. The days that followed were filled with activities to help the children settle in. Clara started attending a new school, while Emma and Tom adjusted to a new pace of life. Though the pain of loss was still present, the constant presence of Mrs. Margareth brought a sense of stability and security that they had never experienced before. The first days in the mansion were a mix of emotions for Clara, Emma, and Tom. There was the initial shock of being in such a luxurious environment, so different from what they knew. The children, who had lived in a modest apartment, now had their own rooms, new clothes, and meals prepared by chefs. The house, once austere and severe due to Mrs. Margaretha's discipline, began to soften with the presence of the children, bringing new life to the home. Clara, in particular, slowly began to adapt to her new reality. The pain of losing her parents was still intense, but she found comfort in the constant presence of Mrs. Margareth, who revealed herself to be a caring and attentive aunt. Mrs. Margareth, for her part, felt a renewal in her life, filling a void she didn't know existed. Taking care of the children brought a new sense of purpose to her existence. "How are you feeling, Clara?" Mrs. Margareth asked one evening as they sat together in the living room. Clara thought for a moment, her eyes wandering over the luxurious decor of the room. "I'm still getting used to everything. Feels surreal in a way. But I'm very grateful for everything you're doing for us." Mrs. Margareth smiled, squeezing Clara's hand. "I want you to feel at home here. This is your home now, and I'll do everything to make sure you and your siblings are happy." Little by little, Clara began to excel at school, showing a special talent for writing. She loved to read and write stories, finding in them a way to express her emotions and deal with her grief. Mrs. Margareth, noticing Clara's potential, encouraged her to follow her dreams, offering support in every possible way. She bought books, hired tutors, and ensured that Clara had every opportunity to develop her talents. "You have a gift, Clara," Mrs. Margareth said one day, after reading some of the girls' writings. "Keep writing, because the world needs to hear your voice." Emma and Tom also adapted well. Emma showed a special talent for music, and Tom a natural ability for sports. Mrs. Margareth made sure both had access to extracurricular activities, encouraging them to explore their interests and talents. The house, once quiet and lonely, was now full of laughter, music, and the vibrant energy of children growing and learning. Years passed, and the children flourished under Mrs. Margaretha's care. Clara, in particular, found a new passion for storytelling, using her life experiences as inspiration. She began writing short stories and poems, and Mrs. Margareth couldn't have been more proud. With each new story, she saw young Clara emerge stronger and more confident, turning the pain of the past into art and beauty. Clara and her siblings' story, which began with tragedy, transformed into a journey of resilience, growth, and love. Life, with all its unexpected twists, had reunited a family that seemed lost. With Mrs. Margaretha's support, Clara found new hope and a path forward. Now, with a future full of possibilities, she was ready to face the world with courage and an open heart. The mansion, once just a cold structure, was now a home full of life, laughter, and love. Mrs. Margaret, who had once been so focused on her career and social status, found her true purpose in caring for the children. And Clara, who once felt alone and desperate, now knew that with love and support, she could overcome any challenge. Together, they began to build a new life, one day at a time, with the promise of a bright and love-filled future.